Hi everyone, I'm Elisabeth Baker, as I'm sure all of you mostly know, and I'm a candidate for Master's in Interpreting and Translation Studies. And I'm going to be talking about my translation project, which I did on a text called, well, I translated it as The Devil of Fiction, and the source title is El Diablo de la Ficción, and I'll talk more about the title later on. Okay, so the author of this work is Francisco Sanchez Perez, and he got his PhD in sociology at La Universidad Complutense de Madrid with a master's in anthropology and history, and he's done fieldwork in Spain, Peru, and Mexico. And this specific work that I translated is very interesting because of the fact that it's like an academic paper, but he did it instead of using an essay, he took the form of a short story in order to convey the idea that in anthropological writing, fiction comes into play and it's innately a part of it, because when the ethnographer is surveying his interlocutor, he's kind of like pushing them to get the answer he wants, or maybe the fact that he asked them about a topic that they've never thought about, so therefore they're kind of making up a thing, which makes it fiction. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the story because I think it's important to know. There's a lot of different aspects that come to play into this story. If you look on my poster outside, there's a web that has all the different parts that we're kind of playing into. There's anthropology, ethnography, mythology, and then because of the fact that it is a short story literature, there's the author's voice and his style. Okay, so in the story, there's the protagonist is Nacho, and he's doing a dissertation in Peru. So he's doing field work there, and then he's back in Madrid at the start of the story, and he's lost all of the recordings for his, to write up his dissertation. And so he starts freaking out, and he's trying to find a way to get these recordings back through the rest of the entire story. So we find he ends up going back to Peru in order to get the stories, and we learn about a friend of his named Cayetano, which is an interesting aspect of the story because Cayetano is also a writer, and one day Nacho sees a transcript on his desk that has the initials FSP, and so he's back in Madrid looking for more publications by Cayetano, and he finds a book called El Ladrón de los Mitos that also has the initials FSP. And so if we look at these initials FSP, they actually relate to our author, Francisco Sanchez Perez, who does in fact have a book that's titled El Ladrón de los Mitos. So that would make it seem that Sanchez Perez is actually taking the form of Nacho and writing from this perspective, and that at the same time Cayetano is the same person. And so it kind of comes into play. And another interesting aspect is Achilles, which is he was the mentee of Nacho. And at one time when he goes back to Peru, he comes up and sees Achilles in his palapa, and he's actually doing an ethnographic survey. So at one point we see him asking the question as the ethnographer, and then he's trying to answer it actually as an interviewer. So he's taking on both parts, which would also suggest that he learned this skill from Nacho. So this kind of comes into play. This made me think of this image here, that there's the devil on one side, which is telling Nacho to make up the words of his informants, and there's an angel who's telling him that that's unethical and you can't do that in this type of writing. And all these aspects just added on to this idea that this was actually what was going on the whole time, that he didn't really ever have recordings. So it's a really good story. There's a lot of aspects I could discuss, but I think that these are the most pertinent aspects. And yeah, that's why I ended up doing the literal translation, The Devil of Fiction. So I used more theories than just these two, but I think that these were the ones that played most into my translation. The same as Sam, I used Nita's idea of first you have to analyze the source text, transfer it, and then reconstruct it. There were a lot of challenges in the source text, and I think that came into play with the unique style that it was. And Sanchez Perez has a very specific style with his syntax and with his lexicon usage. So I tried to do this and make it work well in English for the target audience, but I also used Venuti's foreignization theory, which is closer, keeping your text closer, the target text closer to the source text, and it's kind of bringing out the foreign in the target text. So I did that, and we'll see here it says that you use calquing and borrowing. Borrowing is when you use like baguette from French or quesadilla from Spanish. Those are borrowed words, and I actually do that in this translation, and we'll see that in my challenges, which I'm going to discuss now. Okay, so as I said, there were a lot of challenges that came into play. It was a very tough text. In my review, I split it up in language-based problems as well as culturally based problems. So some of the language-based problems were syntax, as I mentioned. He had a very specific style where Spanish naturally already has longer sentences than English. So this was actually even more so than the typical Spanish. And I personally thought that this would be unnatural for English readers to read like a sentence that was a whole paragraph, so I mostly modified it. And there was also a lot of uncommon lexicon, so it was like words that wouldn't typically be used in everyday language. And I saw this as part of his style, and it was throughout the entire text. So, for example, here we see the source text word is mosqueo en cabreo. And so, in the context is el mosqueo inicial por la excesiva demora en empezar a escuchar mi voz. Con la primera pregunta se tornó rápidamente en cabreo al ver que no salía sonido alguno de la cinta. So you can see from my translation, the bolded words are what I translated. The initial bother of the excess delay in hearing my voice with the first question quickly turned into a frenzy at seeing that no sound was coming from the tape. So this particular problem required a lot of research, both in Spanish in order to find what the true meaning was, and then also in English to try and find a word that conveyed the same meaning, but also that wasn't as common. At first I had chose annoyance for mosqueo, but I figured that was kind of more common, and I ended up choosing these. And this was a very predominant problem. Okay, so there are also a lot of culturally based problems. Up here, the ones I addressed in my paper were metaphors and colloquialisms and cultural references. I don't have an example of a colloquialism, but they are in my review and my text. So here's an example of a metaphor. El peque me dejó en la embarcadero y se fue, y yo a la vista del panorama desolador que tenía ante mí, empecé a deambular de palapa en palapa, arrastrando el alma con los pies. So the actual metaphor that I was looking at was this one, arrastrando el alma con los pies. If I were to have translated this literally, it would have been something like dragging my soul with my feet. And I just didn't really think that for an English audience, specifically for an American audience, this would be a good metaphor. But we can see here that it gives the image that Nacho is very disheartened, he's lost all of his recordings, and this is when he actually goes back to Peru and he finds out the village is completely empty. So we see that it's trying to get the idea across that he's just, feels defeated. So I actually translated it as, the peque dropped me at the pier and left. I, in the view of the devastating panorama that was in front of me, began to wander from palapa to palapa, dragging my heart by a string. And I thought that this metaphor worked better because I think specifically in an American context, we really use the idea of heart and use that imagery for metaphors, like we have, you broke my heart, and things like that. So I thought that that would give the correct image as well as the meaning. And my last point is about cultural references, and this had a lot of different aspects because Sanchez Perez is from Spain, so there was the use of Peninsular Spanish. But then since Nacho was actually doing field work in Peru, there is actually a lot of indigenous words. So these are some of our examples, and we actually saw the first two in my metaphor, palapa and peque, and these two are very predominant, at least seen on every single page. So if palapa were to be translated literally, it'd be something like hut or shack, and I thought that that could give a negative connotation, which doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation in the source. It's just where they live. And peque is actually, it's a small boat that's specifically used in the Peruvian region on the Amazon for tours. And I could have translated it literally as a canoe, but another thing is that it's also motorized. And on my poster there's an image and it looks different. There's like a difference between it and a canoe. And the last one I chose to point out was chambira, which is a palm tree that's specific to areas around the Amazon. And I also kept that. So I guess there was a lot of challenges that I had to face. But another thing, a reason I didn't translate these was because I think that also in the Spanish text they could be a little hard, like maybe people would be like, what is peque or what's palapa? But I think the author also doesn't point it out because he wants his audience to be intrigued and therefore kind of pick it up from the context. And after seeing it once or twice, you would know, oh, this is where they live, or this is a boat of some sort. So I thought that that was important to keep the same. And I also think it's interesting to point out that I do believe at the end of the story, Nacho ends up falling for the devil, because at the end we see that he's in Peru and he talks to Cayetano, and Cayetano kind of just make the words up. And so we don't know, but at the very last scene he's going to he goes for a walk around the village, and then he takes the peke, and then there's a taxi driver that asks him, are you going to the airport? If so, I'll knock off half price. And so he's still in the peke, and he's like, no, I'm actually going to go to El Último Rinconcito del Mundo, which is a cantina that's referenced a lot throughout the story. And then the taxi man and the boatman exchange a look, which I think suggests, because Cayetano said the best way to make up the words is to live like one of the villagers would live. So that's what I did.
Answer your question?
What made you decide to choose to translate a literary text? Was that something that you've always been interested in, or?
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in it because I like creative writing, and I've actually written some short stories. So I thought that this text was interesting to me. And then I also, after I read it, I wanted to translate it even more because I thought it had a lot of really interesting aspects. So, interests again.
Yeah, I was interested in the idea of keeping it opaque, not translating certain term, just to keep it opaque for the readers of the places. I mean, in Caribbean literature, that happens quite a lot too. Instead of translating Creole, for example, or having a glossary, you make the choice not to.
Yeah, I think that it's maybe added a little intrigue. So.
Makes the reader work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one clarification on Elisabeth's suggestion of Professor Frankel, who was the second reader for this work, and he noticed that the explanation of the title by Elisabeth is the same explanation that the author offers, because this story was published in the Journal of Anthropology, and they have to provide a short abstract and the title of the story, or the title of the article, of course. And the English version is exactly the same version Elisabeth provides. But she agreed on that because after reading the story, Elisabeth decided that was the best approach. There was a little explanation would work perfectly here, it would fit perfectly here, but there were some other options. Sorry, that's my hey. And sorry.
That's okay.
And just to make that clarification, because I think that's important, that it was not just the first approach, but it was kind of a process, right, Elisabeth?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.